Look down at your hand right now. If your ring finger stretches past your index finger, scientists say something happened to you before you were even born, before you had a name, before your parents knew if you were a boy or a girl, something written into your body that you've been carrying in plain sight your entire life. It sounds almost too strange to be true. A simple glance at your own hand, something you've probably never thought twice about, might actually be a window into a moment that happened when you were smaller than a grain of rice, floating in the dark, weeks before your heart had even finished forming its final shape. And yet, for more than 100 years, scientists across the world have been measuring this exact thing, publishing thousands of research papers about it, and slowly piecing together what it really means. It's called the digit ratio. Specifically, the ratio between your second finger, the index finger, and your fourth finger, the ring finger. Researchers write it as 2D to 4D, a shorthand for second digit to fourth digit. It sounds clinical, almost boring, until you understand what it's believed to represent. Because according to a growing mountain of scientific evidence, this ratio isn't random. It isn't just a quirk of bone growth. It may be a kind of biological echo, a faint signature left behind by the hormones that washed over you in the womb back when your entire body was still being built from scratch. Here's how it works. Sometime around the 14th week of pregnancy, long before an ultrasound can even reliably show if a baby is a boy or a girl, something important is happening in the tiny hands forming inside the womb. The bones of the fingers are growing at different rates, and the pace of that growth appears to be influenced by the balance of two hormones flooding the developing body: testosterone and estrogen. Higher exposure to testosterone relative to estrogen tends to produce a longer fourth finger compared to the second. Higher relative exposure to estrogen tends to do the opposite, leaving the index finger closer in length to, or even longer than, the ring finger. This is why, on average, men tend to have a lower digit ratio than women. A lower ratio simply means the ring finger is longer relative to the index finger. Women, on average, tend to have a digit ratio closer to 1, meaning the two fingers are more similar in length, or the index finger is slightly longer, but averages are just averages. There's enormous variation within each sex, which is exactly why this measurement has fascinated researchers for so long. It isn't a perfect predictor of anything. It's a clue, a subtle physical trace of something that happened deep inside the womb, and scientists have spent decades trying to figure out just how much that trace can tell us. What makes this even more remarkable is that once this ratio is set, it appears to stay remarkably stable. Unlike so many other physical traits that shift and change as we grow, that get taller or shorter, that change shape entirely during puberty, the relationship between your index and ring finger seems to lock into place early and stay there. Studies following children over time have found the ratio doesn't meaningfully change with age, and it isn't disrupted by the hormonal storm of puberty. In other words, the print left on your hand in the womb is still there today, unchanged, decades later. For a long time, this was treated almost like a curiosity, a strange footnote buried in anatomy textbooks. A German anatomist named Ecker actually first noticed and described this finger-length difference all the way back in the 1870s. But it wasn't until more than 100 years later in the late 1990s that a researcher named John Manning brought the concept back into the spotlight and turned it into a serious area of scientific study. Manning proposed that this ratio could serve as a kind of retrospective biomarker, a way to estimate how much testosterone a person was exposed to before birth simply by measuring their fingers as adults. It was a bold idea. If true, it meant that something as simple and accessible as a tape measure could offer a window into prenatal biology that would otherwise require invasive testing or, more realistically, would be completely impossible to observe after the fact. Since then, the floodgates opened. Thousands of studies have measured digit ratios in men, women, and children around the world, testing whether this simple physical trait actually correlates with anything meaningful. And the honest answer, the one that separates real science from the sensational headlines you might see online, is that some of these connections hold up surprisingly well, some are shaky at best, and some fall apart entirely when tested carefully. Let's start with what actually seems to have solid genetic backing, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Researchers have long known that finger length runs in families, but knowing something is heritable and knowing exactly which genes are responsible are two very different things. Twin studies and family studies have estimated that roughly 60% of the variation in finger length between individuals can be traced back to genetics, with the remaining variation shaped by environmental factors, including that prenatal hormone exposure we just talked about. But which genes, specifically, and this question sent scientists digging through the human genome, and what they found connects back to something almost poetic. There's a group of genes called AOX genes, short for homeobox genes, that act like master architects during early development, And these genes don't just build fingers and toes, they also guide the formation of the reproductive organs. Because the same genetic blueprint that shapes your hands is intertwined with the blueprint that shapes your gonads, researchers believe this shared developmental pathway might explain why finger proportions end up subtly linked to hormone levels in the first place. It isn't that your fingers are somehow sensing testosterone directly. It's that the same underlying genetic machinery is responsible for building both systems at roughly the same time, which means disruptions or variations in that machinery can leave fingerprints, quite literally, on your hands. Before we get to the genetics, it's worth pausing on how researchers actually measure this trait in the first place, because the method matters more than you might think. In the earliest studies, scientists simply used a ruler or a caliper, asking participants to lay their hand flat on a table, while a researcher measured from the crease at the base of the finger to the very tip. That approach is quick and cheap, which is why so many early studies relied on it, but it also introduces small human errors. A slightly different hand position, a slightly different starting point for the measurement, and the numbers can shift just enough to blur the picture. Because of that, more rigorous studies have turned to photocopies of the hand, high-resolution scans, and even X-ray images, which allow researchers to measure bone length directly, rather than relying on skin and soft tissue that can bend, stretch, or swell. This might sound like a minor technical detail, but it actually explains a lot of the inconsistency you'll find across different digit ratio studies. Two research teams studying the exact same question can end up with meaningfully different results, simply because one used calipers on living hands and the other used X-rays of bone. When you're trying to detect something as subtle as a hormonal echo from early pregnancy, precision isn't a luxury. It's the difference between spotting a real pattern and chasing statistical noise. There's also the question of ethnicity and population differences, something researchers have taken seriously as this field has matured. Studies conducted across different ethnic groups and geographic regions have found that average digit ratios do vary somewhat from population to population. Yet remarkably, the core pattern, the sex difference between men and women, tends to hold up consistently across nearly every population studied, even as the exact average numbers shift. That consistency is part of why researchers remain confident that something biologically real is being captured here, even while acknowledging that culture, ancestry, and measurement technique can all introduce their own layers of variation on top of the underlying signal. Then came the large-scale genetic studies, the kind that search across the entire human genome for specific variants tied to a trait. In one of the most significant efforts of its kind, researchers analyzed genetic data from more than 15,000 people and then confirmed their findings in a much larger group of nearly 76,000 additional participants. What they discovered was a set of 11 specific locations in the genome connected to digit ratio, 9 of which had never been identified before. 2 genes in particular kept surfacing across different studies. One called SEMACE1, located on chromosome 14, and another called LAN28B, located on chromosome 6. LAN28B turned out to be especially interesting. In a separate study involving children from 2 independent research groups, one following children in the United Kingdom and another studying adolescent twins in Australia, scientists found a specific genetic variant within the LAN28B gene that was consistently associated with digit ratio. Every extra copy of this particular genetic variant that a child carried was linked to a small but measurable increase in their digit ratio, meaning a relatively longer index finger. And crucially, this wasn't a fluke result from a single study. It was independently replicated in a separate group of nearly 3,700 additional children, which is exactly the kind of repeated confirmation that gives scientists confidence. A genetic link is real and not just statistical noise. Now, here's where it's important to slow down and be honest about the scale of these effects, because this is where a lot of sensational headlines quietly mislead people. Even with all 11 of those confirmed genetic locations combined, researchers estimated they only explain about 4% of the total variation in digit ratio across the population. 4%, that means the vast majority of what determines whether your ring finger is longer or shorter than your index finger remains, for now, genetically unexplained. Some of it is almost certainly hiding in genetic variants scientists haven't identified yet. Some of it comes down to that prenatal hormone environment we talked about earlier. And some of it may simply be biological randomness, the natural variation that exists in how any body develops. So when you hear a headline promising that DNA has finally revealed the secret behind your finger length, the real, more nuanced truth is this. Scientists have found real genetic threads connecting to this trait. Genes like LAN28B and SEMACE1 that show up again and again in large, carefully replicated studies. But they haven't found a single master gene that explains it all. It's a puzzle with several confirmed pieces and many more still missing. There's another piece of evidence that has quietly strengthened the hormone theory over the years, and it comes from a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, sometimes shortened to CAH. This is a medical condition present from birth, in which the adrenal glands produce unusually high levels of androgens, the same category of hormone that includes testosterone. Because researchers already know, with medical certainty, that individuals with this condition were exposed to elevated androgen levels during development, it created a rare natural experiment. If the hormone theory of digit ratio holds up, then people with this condition should show a more masculinized digit ratio pattern than the general population, meaning a comparatively longer ring finger. And that's exactly what multiple studies and a broader analysis pooling their results together have found. Children with this condition consistently showed lower, more masculinized digit ratios compared to children without it. This is considered one of the stronger pieces of supporting evidence in the entire field, precisely because it doesn't rely on indirect statistical correlation the way so many other digit ratio studies do. It's grounded in a known, medically confirmed difference in hormone exposure, which makes the resulting pattern in finger length far more convincing. Now let's talk about the part of this story that tends to generate the most excitement and also the most controversy: what digit ratio has been linked to beyond just genetics and hormones. Because if the theory holds, and this ratio really does reflect prenatal testosterone and estrogen exposure, then researchers reasoned it might also correlate with traits and behaviors known to be influenced by those same hormones. This idea has led to an enormous, sprawling body of research testing digit ratio against dozens upon dozens of human characteristics. Take alcohol consumption, for example. One study specifically examined the relationship between digit ratio and drinking habits and found that people with a longer ring finger relative to their index finger, suggesting higher relative prenatal testosterone exposure, tended to report higher alcohol consumption. Interestingly, this pattern showed up more strongly in men than in women, which researchers suggested might point towards sex hormones playing some role in vulnerability to heavy drinking. But even the scientists behind that study were quick to add an important caveat. A correlation like this doesn't prove that hormone exposure before birth causes someone to drink more as an adult. It simply identifies a pattern worth investigating further, one small thread in an extremely complicated tapestry of genetics, upbringing, culture, and personal choice. Then there's competitiveness. Researchers running large surveys and structured economic experiments looked at whether digit ratio predicted how competitive people were, both in how they described themselves and in how they actually behaved when placed in competitive situations involving real decisions and consequences. The results were a mixed bag, and honestly, that mixed outcome tells you a lot about how real science actually works. When people were simply asked to rate their own competitiveness, there was a measurable link between digit ratio and those self-reported scores, and this pattern was especially strong among younger participants. But when researchers looked at how people actually performed in structured competitive experiments involving real money and real choices, that link completely disappeared. There was no statistically meaningful connection between digit ratio and actual competitive behavior in those experiments. This is a crucial distinction. It suggests that whatever this ratio might be tapping into, it may relate more to how people perceive and describe themselves than to how they actually behave when it counts. Digit ratio has also been explored as a potential clue in far more serious areas, including autism spectrum disorder. Some researchers have investigated whether measurable differences in digit ratio show up in individuals with autism traits, based on the theory that atypical prenatal hormone exposure might play some role in certain neurodevelopmental conditions. Early findings in this area have been intriguing enough to warrant further investigation, but scientists studying this topic have also been careful to note that much more rigorous research involving people who have been formally and clinically diagnosed rather than relying on self-reported traits is still needed before any firm conclusions can be drawn. Beyond that, researchers have poked and prodded at digit ratio's potential connection to an almost dizzying range of other traits: fertility, immune system function, athletic performance, sleep quality, personality traits sometimes grouped under labels like the so-called dark triad, which includes tendencies toward manipulation, self-centeredness, and impulsivity, mental toughness in athletes. Even risk for certain adult-onset diseases has been examined through this lens. Some of these studies report intriguing patterns. Others find nothing at all. And this inconsistency isn't a flaw in the concept of digit ratio itself, so much as it's a reflection of how difficult it is to study something this subtle in human populations, where genetics, environment, culture, and countless other variables are all tangled together at once. It's also worth mentioning athletic performance, a topic that shows up constantly in this field, especially in research involving elite athletes and physically active young adults. Some studies have reported that individuals with lower digit ratios, meaning relatively longer ring fingers, tend to perform better in certain physically demanding sports. And researchers have proposed that this might tie back to prenatal testosterone influencing muscle development, cardiovascular efficiency, or even competitive drive later in life. Other research has examined digit ratio alongside psychological traits in athletes, including measures of mental toughness and resilience under pressure, finding scattered but inconsistent associations that differ depending on the sport, the sex of the participants, and how mental toughness itself was measured. As with so much of this field, the pattern that emerges isn't a clean, universal rule. It's a loose tendency that shows up in some contexts and disappears in others, which is exactly what you'd expect from a trait, shaped by dozens of interacting genetic and environmental factors, rather than a single dominant cause. In fact, one particularly important study focused specifically on women using precise radiographic measurements, rather than simple ruler measurements, which are known to be less accurate. The study tested digit ratio against a huge range of variables, including body measurements, behavior, nutrition, health outcomes, occupational patterns, and fertility. And after all that careful measurement and analysis, the researchers found no significant relationship between digit ratio and any of these outcomes in their female participants. This kind of result almost never makes headlines, because a headline announcing that scientists found nothing doesn't generate the same excitement as one promising your fingers reveal a hidden secret about your personality. But these null results are just as scientifically important as the positive ones. They help researchers understand where this theory genuinely applies and where it simply doesn't hold up under rigorous testing. So where does that leave us? What can we actually honestly say about the length of your ring finger compared to your index finger? Here's the clearest way to put it. Your digit ratio is real, it's measurable, and it does appear to be connected, at least partially, to the hormonal environment you experienced before you were born. Specifically, the balance between testosterone and estrogen your developing body was exposed to around the 14th week of pregnancy. Genetics also plays a substantial role, and scientists have identified specific genes, including Lin28B and SMOCI1, that show consistent replicated associations with this trait across multiple large studies involving tens of thousands of participants. These aren't fringe findings. They've been confirmed in separate populations, in different countries, using different research teams, which is exactly the kind of independent replication that gives a scientific finding real credibility. At the same time, it would be misleading to suggest that measuring your fingers can reveal deep truths about your personality, your health risks, or your future behavior. The genetic variants scientists have identified so far only account for a small fraction of the overall variation in digit ratio, somewhere around 4%. That means there's still an enormous amount we don't understand about what shapes this trait. And when it comes to the flashier claims you might see circulating online, that your finger length predicts your competitiveness, your risk of addiction, your personality type, or your athletic destiny, the actual research tells a much more careful, much more nuanced story. Some associations show up consistently across multiple studies. Others appear in one study and vanish in the next. And some, when tested rigorously, simply aren't there at all. It's also worth addressing directly and plainly why this topic keeps resurfacing in viral posts and clickbait headlines in the first place. There's something deeply appealing about the idea that a simple glance at your own body could unlock a hidden truth about who you are. It taps into a very old, very human desire to find meaning and pattern in the physical world, the same instinct behind palm reading and astrology, except this time wrapped in the language of genes and hormones instead of stars and planets. The difference, and it's an important one, is that digit ratio research is grounded in real, peer-reviewed, replicated science, even if the popular retellings of it tend to strip away every ounce of nuance along the way. A responsible summary of this field sounds nothing like a fortune-telling headline. It sounds like what we've been walking through together, a real biological signal, tangled up with genuine uncertainty, supported by some findings that replicate beautifully and others that fall apart the moment you look closely. This is honestly what makes digit ratio such a compelling case study in how science actually works, as opposed to how it gets portrayed in viral headlines and social media posts. Real science rarely arrives in a single tidy revelation. It arrives in fragments, in replicated findings and failed replications, in careful qualifications and honest admissions of what remains unknown, which is a far less exciting story than the ones that tend to go viral, but a far more trustworthy one. It's not a story about a single dramatic discovery that explains everything. It's a story about patient, incremental progress. A German anatomist noticing something curious about hand bones in the 1870s, a researcher named John Manning reviving that curiosity more than a century later and turning it into a testable scientific theory. Decades of studies involving tens of thousands of participants across dozens of countries. Genome-wide searches, sifting through millions of genetic variants to find the small handful that actually matter, and an ever-growing, ever-refined understanding of what this simple measurement on your hand can and cannot tell you about the biology that shaped you before you ever took your first breath. So the next time you glance down at your hand, and you notice whether your ring finger stretches a little past your index finger or falls just short of it, You're looking at something genuinely remarkable. Not a magical prediction of your fate, not a shortcut to understanding your entire personality, but a real physical trace of a moment that happened deep inside the womb, shaped by a mix of genetics and hormones working together in ways scientists are still working to fully understand. It's a reminder that your body has been quietly recording information about your development since before you were even born, written into your bones in a code that took over a century of careful science just to begin decoding. And somewhere out there, in laboratories around the world, researchers are still measuring fingers, still analyzing genomes, still chasing down that remaining, still mysterious majority of the story, the part of the puzzle that hasn't been solved yet. New genetic databases keep growing larger every year, drawing in hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of participants. And each time researchers run a fresh analysis, they uncover a few more fragments of the picture, a few more genetic variants nudging the ratio slightly one way or the other. It's slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, but it's exactly how real scientific understanding gets built, one careful, replicated study at a time. Because as much as we've learned about the digit ratio since that first curious observation back in the 1870s, the truth is that your hands are still holding on to secrets that science hasn't fully cracked. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all. A measurement this simple, something you could check on yourself in less than 5 seconds, connects all the way back to the earliest, most delicate weeks of your own biological beginning, to genes with names like Lin28B and SMOC1 working quietly in the background, to hormone levels that surged and shifted while your body was still being assembled piece by piece. It's easy to walk through life without ever really looking at your own hands, without wondering why one finger is longer than another, without imagining that this small, ordinary detail might be connected to something as profound as your prenatal development. But now you know. Now every time you glance down, you'll probably find yourself comparing those 2 fingers again, index to ring, wondering just a little about what story your own hand might be quietly telling, and how much more of that story science has yet to uncover. Because if there's one thing this entire field proves, it's that even the smallest, most overlooked parts of our bodies can carry traces of a much bigger, much older story. One that started long before memory, long before words, back when you were nothing more than a rapidly developing cluster of cells deciding, quite literally, how to build itself from the inside out.